Здравствуйте, дорогие друзья. Меня зовут Фуркат Полванзаде, я основатель платформы Sigma и организатор проекта Ташкент-Тбилиси. Мы продолжаем рассказывать об исследовательских проектах, посвященных истории Центральной Евразии. Первый сезон нашей работы состоит из двух больших блоков. Во-первых, это курс «Постколониальные исследования», который был создан усилиями Сергея Абашина и Артема Космарского. В рамках этого курса была проведена серия лекций, посвященных постколониальной теории и ее применению в странах бывшего Советского Союза. Во-вторых, это серия лекций и показов. И эту серию мы решили тематически объединить и посвятить проблеме архива и работе с архивными материалами. Сегодня мы показываем фильм «Her Right». Это новая работа Саодат Исмаиловой, основанная на оригинальных художественных фильмах, художественных и документальных фильмах, созданных в Узбекистане с 1920-х по 1980-е годы. И эта работа посвящена Худжуму. Худжум — это явление, которое дословно переводится как «наступление» или «атака» или «борьба». И она означает государственную кампанию, которая велась в те времена, в 20-е годы 20 века, которая была направлена на эмансипацию мусульманских женщин, против ношения паранджи, с целью вовлечения женщин в публичную жизнь и вовлечения в экономическую жизнь. После показа состоится дискуссия, которая будет посвящена истории женского вопроса в Центральной Азии и последствиям движения Худжум. В дискуссии примет участие режиссер фильма Саодат Исмаилова, а также исследовательница Марианне Камп, доцент кафедры исследований Центральной Евразии в Университете Индианы. При помощи устной истории Марианне исследует изменения, происходившие в повседневной жизни жителей Центральной Азии в советский и постсоветский период. На данный момент Марианне работает над книгой, посвященной коллективизации в сельском хозяйстве в 1930-х годах. Также в дискуссии примет участие Chloé Drieu, французская исследовательница, научный сотрудник Национального центра научных исследований в Париже. Хлоя специализируется на межвоенном периоде истории Центральной Азии и исследует его сквозь призму истории узбекского кино. Дискуссию будет модерировать редактор проекта «Ташкент-Тбилиси», аспирант исторического факультета Центральноевропейского университета Анна Пронина. Сама дискуссия пройдет на английском языке. Вопросы можете задавать в комментариях на YouTube. Так что вернемся через 15 минут. Предлагаем вам еще раз посмотреть фильм, если вы уже посмотрели его, или посмотреть его впервые, если еще не было такой возможности. Тогда вернемся через 15 минут. Спасибо большое. Да, ссылку можно найти тоже на YouTube. Ссылку на фильм.
Hi all, and welcome back. Now we are going to start our discussion. The first question goes to Saodat. Saodat, could you please tell us a little bit more about the history of your work? How did you come up with this idea? And I'm especially interested in how you found and chose the sources for your work.
Well, in fact, it's kind of a long time research project because the working title of this work was called Nurhan. Still in my files, it's called as Nurhan because it was a figure that I think that first encountered in the book of Marianne Kamp, The New Women of Uzbekistan, where there is a portrait of this girl. She was a young dancer from Margilan that was murdered by her brother for her passion and for her desire to dance and to kind of represent herself in a public. No, I think that the question of female representation in a public, it's also one of the interesting points for me in general, related to the country where I come from. So in fact, this research started some time ago, I would say like probably 5 years ago when I went to the archives and I started looking who was Nurhan. Of course, all of us who was born still in the Soviet times, we watched the Soviet films, and it was one of the major subjects in many Soviet films, the subject of female emancipation, the question of Hujum, the Basmachi, the establishment of the Soviet Union in the region. So it was very present in our cultural background. But then all this stopped with the new period, with a new chapter in the history. So also about Hujum we knew because of our grandmothers, even if they were not veiled already, so we have certain type of a knowledge about it. And I guess it is related to time, and to generation, because curiously today, when you speak about Hujum to younger women, they don't know about this part of the history. And it's not only because the memory is lost, but again, how the tools of culture work and how this knowledge disappears with time, basically. So just going back to her right, it started with a research on Nurhan. It started with some reading, going to the Kinafona photo archive in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and collecting material related to that. Then also, thanks to the book of Marianne, I found out about this incredible magazine, women's magazine called Yangi Yol, the new road, the new path, that today is called magazine Saodat. It's also a very interesting publication, which I think you can really understand through this magazine what was the expectation of the state, expectation towards women, how woman is seen or how she's expected to be seen, or what is the ideal woman, no? And last year, more or less this time, I was asked by Video Jam in the UK to create a work with the composer. So I said, okay, I'm gonna work on Nurhan, but since for the budget limits and many other reasons, I had to create this work without filming, and it is a situation that pushed me to look to the archives and to the material that I was collecting for the research. And I would also like to mention that the part of the mute cinema, I know it thanks to Chloé Drieu, who is present here also in her work Fiction Nationale. She made an incredible research on a mute cinema. The awareness of this period was totally absent for us, even if I studied in the State Art University in a cinema department. We were never told that this period of cinema ever existed. We only looked at mute films of Charlie Chaplin, some Russian mute films, but we never knew that actually there were mute Uzbek films. And it's thanks to Chloé that I started looking at these films, and I remember being in Tashkent probably more than 10 years ago, getting some VHS tapes. I don't know exactly from where, and basically the archives come from there, you know, so it's like long-term, I would say long-term interest, you know, like you find, you have a book, you stumble upon a book, you read, you get fascinated, it takes you to a certain research, you meet an incredible talented scholar who is also a very dear friend for me, Chloé, that takes me to her own passion, and then you never know where it takes. And in fact, it took maybe 10 years that this work was kind of coming from little pieces. And so then I said, okay, I'm gonna work with the mute films. But then when I start putting only the mute films together, I understood that this is only one part of cinematic representation of this period. That actually, this is also interesting to understand what is the percentage of or how many films, Uzbek films, were done focusing on a female question in general. I mean, even though we don't have so many women directors in Uzbekistan, but the subject of female integration into the society and emancipation has been very much used in cinema. And so for this reason, I went to the films that I knew about and that fascinated me, like, for example, Without Fear of Ali Hamraev, which is, I think, one of the most outstanding films in Uzbek history if you really want to understand what happened with women and how the Hujum worked and why. And I mean, it's done in a Soviet period in a certain ideological frames, but still it's, I think that it's an incredible portrait of this historical moment. And then, of course, there is a 17 series of film called, it was a TV series called Огненные дороги, The Fire Roads by Shuhrat Abbasov, and it was my father who was a DOP, so it was another very close gaze into that subject. And even, I mean, the film speaks about Hamza. It's a character, it's a poet that was praised during Soviet times, but I don't remember where I exactly read, but Nurhan, she was kind of taken by the theater. She joined the theater group, and Hamza was the one who brought Western theater into Uzbekistan. I mean, it's not only him, there was a bigger group, but still, that's how we associate. So it created this big world because of this one girl, Nurhan, and thanks to the scholars, a big world that I also believe that I didn't yet totally express. I mean, there is still a lot to say about it. Well, I think that I kind of explained.
Yeah, thank you very much. Then another quite short question to you. It's about the title of your work. You mentioned that it came from another movie, right?
Yeah, there is this mute film, Chernyak, Chloé, right? It's from Chernyak, called Her Right, Ее Право. It's an a propaganda film, agit film. And I guess it is because of an incredible scene where a man cuts the screen. Her wife unveils and she joins a factory to work. So he loses her, and then there is this traveling cinema that arrives to the village, and there is a propaganda happening to engage people into a new system. And the husband sees her wife talking from the screen, so basically he tries to kill her, but he goes and cuts the screen on a level of a neck of a woman. And so somehow I was like, well, it totally speaks for that period and for this subject, Her Right. So please don't confuse the title of the work that we have seen and we're speaking about today with the original mute film that was done. I don't exactly remember the year, maybe 29 or 31. Chloé will tell more. I'm sure she knows better than I do.
Thank
31,
you.
I think.
31.
Then I think to better understand the context of your work, would be nice to know a little bit more on the historical context of the Hujum campaign. So, Marianne, I have a question to you. Could you just tell us a bit more about its agenda, how it was employed, and the impact of this campaign?
Yeah, so in the 1920s, in newly formed Uzbekistan, there was a lot of attention to women and to women's issues, and this came out of Communist Party discourse, but it also came out of the Jadid movement from Uzbekistan, which was hugely focused on the idea that if women don't progress, and by progress, Jadids meant get an education, interact in public, be part of this modernizing agenda. If women don't get in on that, then the agenda itself will fail. And so there was already a huge emphasis among intellectuals in cities in Central Asia on this idea that girls need to get a new style education, and why are they wearing a veil anyway? What is that about? So this had been growing as a sphere of discourse and a sphere of action. Young women in particular started to rebel against wearing paranjas and wanted to get rid of them and felt uncomfortable getting rid of them. And then in 1927, the Communist Party decided that this could be a really key tool for political leverage in Central Asia, for kicking off something that might be seen as what Sheila Fitzpatrick talked about as cultural revolution. So a huge form of social change where people's ways of life will be disrupted and they'll embrace the whole modern agenda of the Communist Party. And so this was denoted, it was actually debated in late 1926 among Communist Party members in Uzbekistan, with all of the leading Uzbek figures in the Communist Party. What should we do? What would be a good way to do this? What should we call this? They tried out a few different names and finally decided Hujum. And by Hujum, what they wanted to say was an attack on the old ways. And by that, they sort of included this whole idea that old style education, following Islamic norms, wearing a paranja, treating women as if they are people to be secluded, kept away from the public, all of that needs to go. And so the Hujum was actually this kind of multi-pronged campaign that was about getting more girls signed up for school, getting women out into public activities. But the thing that captured everybody's imagination was unveiling. And so there were these big unveiling meetings. Let's invite all, and it would be women who were associated with the Communist Party through the women's division who would go out to neighborhoods and invite. Invitations can be kind of a form of pressure. Yes, please join us. And they would invite women to come out to these big public meetings and listen to talks and then throw off their paranja and maybe throw it in a fire and burn it. That didn't always happen. And the meetings were not always huge. And then there was this backlash against that, where families were very upset that women in the family had decided to go out in public and burn a paranja and come home with their face open. And in some cases, this resulted in violence. So families tried to rein in the actions of especially younger women, sometimes with brutal physical harm, and occasionally there were these murders. And the Nurhan story then became the most well-known story of such a murder. It became well-known at the time it happened, and then, of course, it got turned into poetry and into music and into film and into all sorts of other things. So that's a little bit about what the Hujum was in that period. One of the things that really strikes me about it, for different reasons, I was scanning through late 1929 Kizil Uzbekistan, the Uzbek language newspaper, and what really was striking to me, although I was looking for other things on collectivization, every issue that you could count on at least one article about the Hujum. Hujum reports from little villages, Hujum discussions, is this working well? And this was the end. So this was a campaign that was really, really front and center for the party in Uzbekistan from 1927 until 1930. So is that enough of an explanation on what Hujum was at the time?
Yeah, I think so. And then as you said, the Hujum campaign was a part of a bigger modernization process. And at the same time, I think cinema as a media was a very modern device for Uzbekistan at this time. So what do you think, which role does the cinema play in this process?
So I think that Chloe is going to be better at answering that than I am. What I can tell you is that the kinds of, the party would organize meetings, and these would be small, they could be large, they could happen among men, they could happen among men and women together. There was a big push to get men and women together in public, and boy, there was a lot of pushback against that. And there came to be a need for something more than just speeches, because frankly, you know, heard one speech, you heard them all, right? So artists were writing poetry to encourage unveiling. Playwrights were creating plays to describe what is wrong with our family life and what is wrong with wearing a veil, and to encourage unveiling. And filmmakers were making these films. And so you get various scattered reports of, at this meeting, they showed this film, or at this meeting, people watched this play, or they heard this poem. We don't get very many of those concrete details. The reports on Hujum are often quite, you know, there was a meeting and there was a speaker, and that's really all you learn. But we have various archival documents that tell us exactly the things that Saodat was talking about earlier in that 1931 film, Yiyo Prava. Agitators went to villages with these traveling cinema kinds of things, and some of them were powered by basically riding a bicycle, quite interesting, so that it was easy to set up in villages, and people came out for that because it was new. So there's a combination of art and desire and newness, all stimulating the embrace, or they hoped, the embrace of modernization. So I'm going to be quiet on that because I think that Chloe knows a lot more about how this film stuff worked than I do.
Yes, so maybe I should start with to point out the fact that cinema is a small part of a broader context to transform society. And of course, at the very beginning, cinema is almost nothing because it's raised from the ground, from zero. So at the beginning, it was a bit difficult to use cinema for propaganda purposes and political purposes. And maybe I would like to very insist on one point, is that the first film studio were created in Bukhara, in Bukharan Soviet Republic at that time, for a very short, it worked for a very short period. But I think it's very important to keep in mind that the local elite, not only Lenin and then Trotsky and Stalin, has a view on how to use cinema for political purposes, for propaganda, but also the local, what we call Jadid or reformist elite, had a view also on theater and cinema that can help the society to see their own defect on the screen and to change and to improve. So I think it's important to keep in mind that the first studio were made in Bukhara, not by the central power or Moscow or whatever Bolshevism or Bolsheviks propagandists, but from a local point of view. So it means that on a local level, there are wish to use cinema for propaganda purposes. But of course, it's very difficult to start from nothing, because you need cinema you need very skilled people technology, different material, and so on. And the film studio at the very beginning, so Bukhara and then in Tashkent, were organized in an old madrasa in a neighborhood called Sheikh Khantaur in Tashkent. And the working condition were very bad, because they were in the mid-20s, there were almost no electricity. So the studio had to work during the night, because during the day there were tramways who were going and using the electricity. So the filmmakers and the staff need to work from midnight until 6 o'clock in the morning. And of course, there is also a very difficult condition with the temperature, because when you develop film, you need like 20 degrees, I think, more or less, for the development process. So in Uzbekistan, in summer and winter, the temperature are very varying a lot. So using film for propaganda was very difficult at the beginning, until the Cultural Revolution, until 27, 28. And moreover, the filmmakers were coming from St. Petersburg, were invited by the local, by Uzbek studio to come to Uzbekistan to make film, but they had their own representation of local populations, and they used to produce much more entertainment film, exotic film, which was not good for propaganda and transforming the society. So we need to wait for 27, 28 to have a proper propaganda film. I would like to say also that it's important to have local actors. So in Saodat's film, we can see that there is a Russian actress, Meserer, if I not mispronounce, who is a Russian. I think it's the film Vtoraya Zhena, the second wife. And there were, for the audience, a problem of authenticity, because she was a Russian. Even if she wanted to, she tried to dance Uzbek dances, it was not obviously the right way to dance. And to make a good propaganda film, you need the people, I mean the audience, to identify with the actor, to act as the actor on the film, to transform himself as the main characters. So it's a very long process, but I think it was reached at the end of the 20s, 28, and especially the early 30s, with such a film as Dочь Святого, the daughter of the saint. Saodat used also a lot no, but a bit. So yeah, the propaganda was quite set up in the early 30s, much more than in the end of the 20s.
Thank you. And now, going back to Saodat's work and to the featured movies that it is made of, I would like to ask you, what is the place of this movie in the history of Uzbek cinema, or at least maybe some of them, and how were they perceived during the Soviet history, and what is more interesting maybe now, if we talk about post-Soviet Uzbekistan, how do people see?
Well, I think it's very, as Saodat said, it's very rare to see these movies. Most of the films which were produced during the 20s and 30s, I think Saodat used some shots in her film. Yeah, and at the end of the 30s, the film were banned from screen. I mean, it was not censorship, but they didn't use it anymore. So there is no authorization to show this movie again. So I think they just like drop in the memory. They disappeared as Saodat. So I think it's very important that Ali Khamraev also use a lot, I think, archival material and to see these images and to see how Saodat used the former and the old silent film. I think it's very important to renew and to present again these films to nowadays audience, and to imagine how hard it was for a woman to be dressed like that, and then how strength you need to get unveiled, because after the unveiling, as Marianne told, it's sometimes a lot of violence occurred, murder occurred, and woman has to reveal, to put again the veil. So I think there is it was very, very well depicted in Saodat's film. I think the tension, the inner tension of woman, and how difficult and how strong you must be to make the step. To move forward.
Thank you. I think that the gender dimension is a central question in this work, and therefore I would like to another question for all of you is about the image of a woman that we see in this in Saodat's work and in these features movies, and whose vision of women it represents. So Saodat, maybe you could start.
Well, there is just a few words about the films that are used in the work Her Right, and the value they represent somehow, I think. There is the spirit of a mute cinema, but then there is these two films that I have discovered while putting this work together by Latif Fazif. We know the works of Latif Fazif more related to a co-production with India. It's Ali Baba, 40 Разбойников and 40 Thieves. I don't know if this is the right translation. And there are some other films of him, but I have never seen these two works, which is called Священная кровь and Подарок Ленина. They both deal with it's a story of girls that get unveiled and they want to go to study, and how they deal with their family, with their parents. And here it's like I suddenly seen not where the creativity start appearing, the way the film is shot, how the camera moves, how the editing is put together, the structure of the film. And it was an amazing discovery for myself as a filmmaker, because there is another issue of not having an access to these films, is that in fact, how can we develop language in Uzbek cinema if we cannot base ourselves in what has been developed already, so like something that has been structured and growing into a visual language, into a cinematographical language, and suddenly we don't have an access to that to go further on, and we direct our gaze into the cinema coming from the other parts of the world. So Latif Fazif was an amazing discovery, and it's like when the subject of Hujum, I think that gets out of the frame of a pure propaganda, and where you start seeing, and here you have purely Uzbek actresses. Of course, again, you relate differently, in the way they look, the gaze, they walk, the body is the way they sit, everything speaks. And then Ali Khamraev, yes, it's another outstanding filmmaker, and Her Right, and also Чрезвычайный комиссар. It's not one of his known films, but there is some incredible shots in the Her Right. It starts, you see a crowd of veiled women, which gives a very strong impact. And then with Shuhrat Abbasov, it gets into another term. It's a cinematic language that changes, and you see how the time changes, the historical situation, political situation changes, and of course the relation of these people to women in general. I think that in the films of Latif Fazif, it's when Uzbek women actresses, important actresses, start appearing. Useless to say about Dilorom Kambarov and Tamara Shakirova that appear in Bistrach. It's their first roles, and they are the two probably biggest icons of Uzbek actresses that exist in Uzbek cinema. Like when you think about female actresses in Uzbek cinema, it's these two beautiful women. And the representation of women, if you compare it to today, how you see them in cinema, of course, it's totally different. Today, unfortunately, it's like going backwards. That's the sensation I have with the major films that are on the screen in Tashkent today. Women are put again into the frame of the family, of giving birth, of being a mother, so the part of a woman who is educated should be educated and has its place and a voice and a role in a society is absent again. So I think that this is also a reason why I believe this subject is important to look at it again, at least to remember it, since a certain privilege I had, for example, in my education and in my formation, the way I was shaped, it's thanks to this part of the history in Uzbekistan that happened through this liberation of women and the modernization of a society.
Thank you. Then, Chloé, maybe you could add something about it from the point of view of the production process of the cinema, for instance, in a sense, how these movies were made and who basically stood behind it.
You mean how they were ordered, or?
Yeah, and for instance, who made the plots for this, or I mean, in terms of portraying women in these movies?
So it's very a collective work. I think that's why it's very interesting to work on as a scholar. So most of the script writers were Uzbek writers, and so they proposed a script and to the film studio, and then the film was shot. As far as the image of women is concerned, I think yes, with the fact that in the early 30s, maybe end of the 20s, actresses were Uzbek, it changed a lot in terms of reception. But of course, reception is also very difficult to deal with because it's hard to have information from the people who were looking at the film and to understand how they react to the image of women. But I can draw maybe 2 or 3 examples because I work a lot extensively on the press, Uzbek press, and you can find some very interesting critiques. And there is a film that Saodat used called Chadra from Oleg Frelich, I think, I don't remember. But it was made in 31 or no, 28. Anyway, and it's the story of a couple of young communists, a man and a woman, who just come back to Uzbekistan to implement the modernization. And in film, you have this image of the train and the whistle. I don't know the term in English, whistle, yeah, which means that an inexorable change will occur, and this is the symbol of Soviet modernization, I mean, cultural revolution. So this couple is coming back to Tashkent and just is very communist and very modern couple, I can say. And it was very interesting to see the critique. And in one of them, it was just written that but we don't know. We don't know to know how they come back. What a woman from Uzbekistan wants to know is how to leave Uzbekistan and to go to Moscow. So I think it was very interesting to see the different viewpoint of this modernization, Soviet modernization. For the filmmakers, it was the modernity comes from Moscow and is bringing to Uzbekistan. And for the Uzbek woman or the related to the press, it was the contrary. The importance for it was important for them to know how to go to Moscow and to get modernized, not in Uzbekistan. So this is one example I can draw from this to answer your question.
There is also a character of the Prakazhonная Chloé. I found her very. It's interesting because the leper, no, the Prakazhonная, yeah, because she falls in love with a Russian man, and it was in Prakazhonная, no, this story. She's married with a local, but then she falls in love with a Russian man, and you look at it and you say, like, for me as a local, it's a really strange plot, you know, like something that doesn't, I don't know, like you say, well, this is absolutely, I mean, it can happen, of course, but for that time, it looked very invented, no? Or
inauthentic.
Yes.
Yeah, this is the problem, because when the filmmakers saw until 31, Nabi Ganiev, until this date, all the filmmakers were coming from Russia, so they were conveying their own representation of women of Uzbekistan, and in a sense, sometimes it was very exotic, very colonial type of representations. So, but I think there is another Shakali Ravat. There is another film from 28, also by I forgot his name anyway, who was a Russian filmmaker, but who worked so much with the Uzbek scriptwriters, actors, consultants, that the film was considered as an Uzbek film, even if it was made by the Russian filmmaker, because it was authentic, it was dealing with the tradition, it was showing, I don't know, the local life, and it was taken as Uzbek by the critics. So I think it's also important in terms of, as we think about what is national cinema. You don't necessarily need an Uzbek filmmaker with an Uzbek scriptwriter, with an Uzbek or Uzbek actors to have a Uzbek national film, which is a very short period, unfortunately, but it happens.
So I'm going to turn back to the question that Anna raised at the beginning, which was about gender. And I'm going to, this is, we could look at all of these films and say, on the one hand, we get a bunch of Orientalist gaze early on, and then we get an Uzbek gaze, but it's an Uzbek male gaze. And in Saodat's film, we get an Uzbek woman's gaze and creating images of women. And so one of the things that I find in your film, Saodat, is your strong attention to the emotionality of women as they are facing fear or joy or wonder or opportunity or threat. You focus on face, you focus on eyes, you focus on their ways of conveying what they're feeling. And all of that is there in the original films that you're drawing from, the archival films. You took those images from there. I guess what I want to, I'm going to push on the gender question. Would these films have been different in the 30s or in the 60s if the filmmaker had been a woman instead of a man, an Uzbek woman instead of an Uzbek man? Is there a difference between male and female gaze, really? Or are cinema products actually more complex than that, and interaction amongst directors and producers and artists and actors, so that it would be reductive to say what we're getting here is a male gaze?
This is a very nice and complicated thinking or question, or, you know, like, because also there is a dilemma inside of me, you know, like when I was doing this work, there is a lot of questions related to Hujum itself, you know, like that what I got from your book also, you know, like when you read the interviews of women, I mean, our gaze was like, okay, this was an emancipation, I got an education, I speak the languages, I'm free. But then when you go to the source and you understand how challenging and how dramatic it was for these women to open their faces, and me as a part of this culture, I feel them and I totally understand, and it's also so there is this how can I say, you know, like you go from one side to the other, you know, like you understand, but you say, yes, of course this is right. But what I think is important is not to forget, you know, like whatever happened, whatever was the cost, is to look back at it. And now going to the gender question, I am a filmmaker, and I not only work with the archives, I also made my first feature film, and then I did some other format films and works, and I'm working on my next feature film where the characters are women, and where very much often I have addressed the question why I work with this feminine world, but I work with this feminine world if to compare to this the films that are used in her right in more private space. So it's not about their social representation or dealing with the social questions and public life, but it's more looking at their inner spaces. And then again, also, I don't know whether I do that because I'm an independent filmmaker, you know, I don't work with a state fund in my country, you know, where probably I would have been asked, like, who is a character of today? A woman character. I don't know who is a woman character of today in Uzbekistan, honestly. In which point of view? In a point of view as an independent filmmaker, or as a woman, just as an Uzbek woman, who is a hero for me today? Then probably I would say one thing, while probably for the state cinema, that character would be different. So it's a complicated question, you know, it's really complicated, but there is definitely, I would say, it's a gaze from outside, Marianne. It's a gaze from outside. It's a gaze from a point of view of a political need at that period, and it is interesting probably to as a documentation of history, even if it was feature films. There are feature films, most of the works that are used, but I guess it's more like looking back at the history. But another part that I really find fascinating in these films, that not only related to gender, but this is a force of cinema, no? Like, for example, Dodge Svitova, the daughter of a saint. There are some incredible moments related to certain rituals that have disappeared, but you can go back to this film, even if these films are not ethnographic films or document, but they carry that. So cinema has this incredible power to take the moment and conserve it, you know, it closes, it packs it. And then when you go back there, even if it is a propaganda film, it leaks through, you know, it goes through other information, that it's like a time machine, you know. So you go there and then you find yourself in another period, another situation, and if you go more precisely, then it's can become a starting point for thinking differently, or using your creativity to reimagine that moment. You understand what I mean, no? So, but your question is, it's as important as gaze from the state, from the center to our culture, as well as the question of how women were portrayed by, not by a woman.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to raise another big issue, and I think that would be the last big issue to discuss. It is the question of memory on Hujum now. I would like to ask how much present it is now on both on the level of private history, family history, and public history. And I think, Marianne, since you worked so much on the oral testimonies about Hujum, you could start answering this.
There we go. So I did those interviews a long time ago, back in 1992, 93. And so I was able to talk with women who were old enough that they themselves had unveiled during the Hujum. So for them, it wasn't a passed on story, it was a direct experience of their own lives. And that's what oral historians do. And then when things get passed on to younger generations, what we are collecting are traditions that may be talked about or may not be, and so I know many of my friends in Uzbekistan. There are many, many, many people from families who say, well, I know my grandmother's story was this, or my great-grandmother's story, or we heard about this. And others who say, back in that time, women were forced to unveil, and that's the story that they get in their family. And so there are these competing stories. And then there's the fact that public discourses and the ways that we memorialize history through museums, through movies, through textbooks and fiction and everything else shapes the way that people think about the past, so that what people may be sharing today may have no relation to what their great-grandparents experienced, but may simply be a collective narrative about what happened. So because during the Soviet period, there was lots of attention to this kind of consistently. You could count on it every year. March 8th, you get International Women's Day, and in Uzbekistan, you get some memorial thing about the Hujum, always. And that went away with the end of the Soviet Union. And so there's a formation to Soviet period memory and discourse about Hujum, which really evaporates as a public way of telling people how to remember in the 1990s. And versions of the past become multiple and not very detailed in a lot of ways, because for quite a while, the Soviet period was not the one that anybody wanted to talk about. If you're talking history, you want to talk about something that has more grand possibilities like Timur, or more victimizing possibilities like the Russian invasion, but please let's not talk about the Soviet period. And so I'm not sure what has happened to memory of that time period now, because memory then actually it's cultural discourse, and the cultural discourse is really focused on very other things. So I'm always fascinated when I meet people and they say, oh yeah, we have this story in our family, my grandmother, my great-grandmother. So clearly things do get passed on, and people talk about how grandmother unveiled or how grandmother went to school or something like that. But it's within families, it seems, more than a big socially shared story.
Thank you. Saodat, would you like to add something on this?
Well, me as a local, I don't remember my grandmother speaking about it. Honestly, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but I think that the situation with the collectivization and repression was bigger in the family. So that was the story that was transmitted in details, and I think that was a bigger trauma. The repression, Gulag, dislocation of the whole family from a city to a city, the collectivization, it was much, much bigger. So this was a bigger focus within the family. While, of course, we knew what was Paranje, but there was not a big focus on that. So I guess she was born in 1924. She was not veiled, so she didn't leave it, and she didn't transmit it. Don't know if her mother was veiled or her grandmother was, but the other part of the history was kind of more, was bigger within the family. But what is interesting is that this object itself, it's really strong, the paranja. It's not like a burqa from Afghanistan or from what we see in the Middle East. It's way more imposing and way more monumental somehow, I would say, no? Like using the horse tail to weave a net in front of the face. It's incredibly powerful. So I start collecting them in some part of my life, and but just frontal part, not being interested on the part that the antiquar collectors would focus on, which is a part with embroidery or that has a kind of a material value, no? But what was interested me was the frontal part, which is a net, and most of the time this net is stitched. It has holes. It has probably like sweat or dirt, or I don't know. But this frontal part for me was always a screen. It's how, through what women were seeing the world. And I'm just telling that because just for fun, I showed it one in Tashkent to one young Uzbek girl. I said, guess what is it? And she couldn't find out. She just turned it around, and she just had no clue. She didn't know how to connect to it, what it is. She had no idea what it was, So in fact, they don't know. And they think that veiling, they don't connect anymore to that object. I think that what they think about veiling today is what comes from other parts of the world, like it's a hijab, which we didn't have in our culture. And so the memory of the Chachuan, this frontal part, it's finished, it's gone.
Thank you so much. It is really, I don't know, somehow impressive details that you mentioned in the end. And there are several questions from the chat. So if you don't mind, and I'll read them. I think so that they are all for you. It is about your work. The first one is that, Saodat, could you please discuss the exquisite sound design in her right?
Well, as I say, it was commissioned by Video Jam in Manchester, and we have presented the work. I think it was, I don't remember the date, but it was March 2020. It was a collaboration with a composer from the UK. This was the condition of the commission, and the composer that worked, her name is Siming To. She's she's a composer based in the UK that played live on this film. But the soundtrack that I kept, it's I have put together from her previous work, so we were in connection with her, so I would share with her the emotions I'm looking for, and then she would send me some ideas, and then I would create the soundtrack. So I'm a little bit, how can I say, the sound space of my works are extremely important for me, and I don't think only visually. I somehow let the sound drive me as a first motivator. So it was hard for me to then use the sound that was done live. So I kept the sound that we have created together with her. So it's thanks to Siming To.
And there is another one on the montage. I will read it as well. Also, it would be great to hear more about how the fabulous montage of eye close-ups at the end came to be. Did you know that you wanted that scene before editing the film?
Well, this was actually like I work very often. I do some kind of experiments. I looked at the films, and then I I said, okay, let's try. It's like making sketches, you know, when you draw, you test, you draw one sketch, then another, then third. So that's how I work. This is probably my, how would I say, you know, I think that the directors, why we need to work with the editors, because editors have a constructive mind. They can construct the idea from the beginning and then use your footage to build the idea, while the film director very often goes after certain emotions or sensations, and that's normally what I do as first always in my work. You know, I use it, so then it's not calling anymore. You know, it's not troubling my mind to structure the idea, because if you go only after the emotion, then you can get lost and basically you don't communicate any direct ideas. So and those images of overlaying, it comes from that, you know, it's when I wanted to satisfy my my emotions. It's like taking the close-ups of these women and looking at their faces, how they were portrayed, and putting them all together, and kind of I thought, okay, I'm gonna create one portrait from different female portraits, but it's going to be one woman that lived that period of history.
Thank you, Saodat. I think now we are coming to the end.
I had one question.
Question.
Yeah, Marianne, I wanted to ask you, so during your research, actually, did you hear any story when basically this or that woman chose herself to unveil, like, or was it always a forced unveiling?
No, I certainly heard stories of women who themselves chose to unveil. One of them was a woman whose life I've written about in a little bit more detail. Her name was Saodat Ismailova, and she was an editor for ultimately for Yarkin Hayat, which was a successor to Yangiol. And she talks about moving to Tashkent with her husband, who was associated with journalism. And they moved there in 1924. And she basically said, well, I wasn't living at home anymore. I didn't want to wear my paranja anymore, so I didn't have to. Essentially, her attitude was she didn't want to wear it, and there was no one around to make her wear it. And the atmosphere that she was living in Eskiduva, in Tashkent, was supportive enough that she could do this. And so I heard variations on this from other people who kind of got the idea of, well, at school, people were talking about unveiling, and so I really wanted to get rid of this thing. So for many of the women I talked to, they unveiled during the Hujum. But some of them actually unveiled before the Hujum, when there's no possibility that it was the heavy hand of the communist state forcing them to do it. That just wasn't what happened. But when I listened to their stories from the period of the Hujum, it's very hard to sort any of that out. What is one's own desire, and what is a set of circumstances that is pushing one? So I heard lots of stories also from women who said, well, yeah, I took it off because they told me I had to, so I did. And they didn't talk about this in any way, shape, or form as their own choice. But of course, all of these are reconstructions in memory. And so to some extent, we can say they know what their emotions were at the time and what their motivations were. But yeah, I certainly heard from women who said, I did this because I wanted to. And I actually fought against my family for the, I had to convince them, I challenged them, I went out, I did this. I had to have support from my family to do it. So does that address what you wanted to know?
Yeah, I think so. Saodat, I had also one more question for you, if I may. I know it's a different work by you, but maybe it would be useful to describe it at least. Your project, Her 5 Lives, which depicts this evolution of how Uzbek women were represented in cinema, basically. maybe you could describe it briefly. So it just
Well, it's also funny because the title "Her Five Lives" comes from from the paper of Marianne Kamp, "The Three Lives of Saodat."
Yeah.
I remember that paper when I read it. It really struck me. You know, like I don't know. Maybe I should go back to it and read it again. But what was left in my mind, how one person tells three types of stories she lived, and she totally believes that each one is true. And I think that it's a very interesting way how a film can be done in general, a feature film, you know, like how one situation is seen or retold or reconstructed, you know, in three totally contradictory ways. So this was a kind of a pandemic story because, you know, 2020, we couldn't film, I couldn't film, I couldn't do anything. So it was a wonderful year, though, for the archives and for the passion and kind of information that you accumulate. So this was an essay that was commissioned by Asian Film Archives, a series of monographs. So I said, well, I'm gonna do this. Especially, I did her right. I looked at all these films. It was totally fresh in my mind. I remember very well the work of Marianne Saodat's Three Lives. And there is also a wonderful article by Guldara Abikeva, who is a film critic from Kazakhstan, who wrote on how women were represented in cinema of Central Asia. So that inspired me as well. So I said, okay, I'm going to look at how women were seen in Uzbek cinema, but taking these five periods, some kind of somehow divided. I think one called Victim of Patriarchy, Machine of Collectivity, I don't remember. So something related to the collectivization. Then there is the third one related to the Khrushchev thaw, when the cinema started being more free. And fourth, it's a perestroika libertine. I mean, the women are suddenly become absolutely different, you know, they become more animal, no, like more in their nature, I would say. Like there is no more limits. I'm a woman, you know, I'm a woman in bad and good way, just take me as I am. And I think that it's a fantastic period in Uzbek cinema for portraying women. It's unresearched, maybe the time will arrive, but I think that it's a beautiful period for female representation in cinema. And then a period of the independence, you know, how women are portrayed. I mean, I think that there is more and more female characters in cinema today, but somehow there is this feeling of being uncertain, unclear, confused, undefined, lots of questions that raise certain type of emptiness. And this is interesting to see, you know, like, okay, there is this period where a woman is portrayed as a victim of a patriarchal society. You see it more in early propaganda films, you know. Then suddenly a woman becomes a part of a society. She's free, but she's like a part of these social realistic paintings, you know. She collects cotton, I don't know, more than everybody in the world. She works on a tractor and she is the best tractorist, better than any man. She's the one who gonna construct the future of a Soviet Union in the East, you know. So another character, then suddenly with the films of Eliorish Muhamedov and Ali Khamraev, a woman can fall in love, you know. For the first time, we see in cinema that she can fall in love and she can express her love and she can have feelings in her eyes and be in her emotions, you know. And I think that it's very beautiful. And then the perestroika arrives. It's a period when there was not anymore neither. It's a Gulnara Abikev, I think that she says that there is no more Muhammad and there is no more Lenin. So all gone, no limits, no frames. We are going back to our archetype as a woman, you know. So so it just explosive, I think, that period for to portray a woman character. And then now, so that's her 5 lives. In certain moment, I had the feeling that I was missing one period. I had the feeling I was missing a woman related to the Second World War. I don't know if Chloé agrees with that, if maybe their woman was different.
I wanted to ask you the question why you skipped the Second World War, but I don't know.
But I think that I did this 5, and then in certain moment I was like, oh, I think that there is one period missing, because there is a big jump from collectivization to Khrushchev. Like what, maybe 20, 30 years, no, Chloé? And
no, but maybe it's the continuity of the tractorist. She's a warrior, but
but I have this feeling, like there is all this generation of Litfuhanum Sarinsakova, the films of Tashkent Gorod Khlebny, they're related to the Second World War. So of course, woman is the one to cure that wound, or to, but I missed that.
maybe you should read. You've already read Svetlana Alexievich Vaina Uvani Niet Litso. I don't remember in Russian. La guerre n'a pas un visage de femme. She focused. She gathered interview from women from the Second World War. Maybe it can give you some ideas. But I remember, so for cinema during the Second World War, it was much more like film concert, maybe dancing and maybe singing, and maybe it's another like woman going to the public sphere. I don't know. Maybe you should investigate. Yeah.
To support men on the war, basically,
Actually, maybe this image is the only image from the Soviet Union which is still used, I think, in modern day Uzbekistan, with this image of the mother who's waiting for her son, or like, yeah, I think maybe, yeah. And what happened now? I mean, with all those magazines, and I think a Saodat magazine still exists, right? Can you describe the woman's image in this magazine? Like, is it?
Well, I think that it's more or less as with the cinema. This is a very interesting. It's more immediate. No, you don't need to watch hours and hours of films, a lot of films, to understand how a woman was portrayed. Here, it's way more simple. In fact, I have managed to scan the covers, only covers of magazine Saodat, Xotin Qizlar journal from 1950 until 2019, and it became Saodat, I think, in 1966. And it's the same as in cinema. In fact, you see how a woman was seen and how she was represented. Just these days, I have been trying to do some new work with these covers of the magazine, and it's the same. So she's the worker, she's a pilot, she's a scientist, she's everything that serves the society. Then you start feeling how the Soviet Union is getting weaker and weaker. So then there is even some covers related to women extra senses. You probably remember when the Soviet Union was collapsing, there were a lot of people making hypnotic sessions, making some visions of the future, so suddenly woman becomes somebody that is a visionary. So it's the same as with cinema, but here it's more immediate. Actually, I have put all those images, covers of a magazine into onto one page, and when you look at it, so you basically understand how a woman was expected to be. And also you see how through the graphic design, you see how the ideology machine was strong in the Soviet Union. It was very solid. And for me, this is communicated through a graphic design, which is outstanding in the Soviet period. you see that they were paying attention to everything, you know, like the letters, the numbers, how it is positioned. It's a beautiful trace of history. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have one more last question. I can read it. Saodat, you mentioned you started to notice local cinematic tradition in the Latif Faizi films. How would you characterize this tradition? What was specific to it in your view?
Well, maybe Nabi Ghanif is more important, no, Chloé, for the local cinema as a local filmmaker, and it's more known. And maybe for me, the figure of Latif Faizi was struck me a lot because we don't hear so much about him as of Nabi Ghanif, who is more important for Uzbek cinema. And especially these films that deal with Подарок Ленина и Qutluk Khan, Святая Кровь, totally forgotten. I think that there is no way to watch these films. And he worked with the DOP. His surname was Pan. He was of a Polish origins, Pan, or they would nickname him Pan, you know, since I grew up in this cinema environment. But I remember Pan, who was also our neighbor. And I knew him as someone, but suddenly in this film, I see this very interesting movement of camera. And this is called the camera, the cinematography can be filmed in a way when you see that they were thinking about editing already. It was not like we're gonna film and then we take it to the editing table and edit. No, the camera is doing that work already, you know, by the way they cut. So what impressed me there, it's the work of a camera and editing in these two works of the Latif Faizi. And then I thought, well, this is interesting because this is something we have totally missed. I don't know where the influence comes from, though. Maybe it's a synergy that was created between the collaboration of the DOP and the editor and the Latif Faizi. But I think that these two films, they really deserve a more attentive look.
Thank you so much. Мне кажется, мы можем на этой ноте закруглиться. Следите за нашими следующими лекциями, показами. Сегодняшнюю дискуссию мы обязательно переведем в режим текста и опубликуем на Сигме. Мы очень постараемся еще снабдить этот материал какими-то визуальными архивными материалами. Это произойдет в течение ближайших месяцев. Всем спасибо за участие. Остаемся на связи. Спасибо большое.
Спасибо. Пока.
Спасибо вам.